back in the 1980s, we figured out this little thing called fax machines, which meant that instead of every newspaper of size in the United States needing to have multiple overseas bureaus, what they really only needed is 2 or 3 people to send the information back and forth. Then we got email, which meant that you really only needed 1 person. In fact, your editing staff didn't have to be abroad at all. Then we got file attachments, and all of a sudden you could have roving reporters that you could dispatch to areas where there were stories, and everyone else you could just kind of close down. Well, now we've got algorithms that are actually writing stories. So we've seen this narrowing of capacity in the press, not just in the United States, but around the world, to the point that unless you're a national government putting out propaganda, you don't perceive a need for having an international news presence. And as this was going on back when I was at Stratfor in the 2000s, we had to develop our own. And so we started working with local reporters and local sources all over the world. And I still deal with, whoops, just about knocked over my computer. And we still deal with a lot of those sources. And the cheat is that we built this model of how the world works with economics and finance and demographics and energy and structures and military and geography and all of it. And we spend most of our time now looking for things that prove us wrong. It's not nearly as healthy for the ego, but wow, it's a big time saver. In fact, I've got a staffer whose primary job every day is to prove me wrong, and wow, she really loves her job. So this is what we would call a standard demographic profile. This is Mexico, lots of children, fewer young adults, fewer mature adults, retirees at the top, and mortality builds it into a pyramid. And when you look at something like this, you're going to have a very different economic structure than what you might have for a country, say, let's pick out, you're still listening, sorry. It's been a nuts sort of experience here for the last, month, as opposed to Germany. So here's Germany, very heavy in the middle age, moving towards retiree. And the difference between the two here is that in Mexico, you're gonna have a consumption-led system because young people do most of the spending. And in Germany, you're gonna have an investment-led system because when you're in your 40s and your 50s, you're saving for retirement. That simple dichotomy is kind of what drives most of what's going on in the global economy and has been driving the global economy for the last 30 years. What that means is we've been in this world where most of the developing world has been the consumption base, and most of the developed world has been the investment base. And that means the propensity for trade between the two is extreme because the poorer countries need the cash, the more advanced countries need the consumption. And so you can have things going back and forth. The Germans are good at high-end stuff, the Mexicans tend to be good at low-end stuff, and some version of this is replicated around the world. So in an environment since the end of the Cold War, when you've got global security provided by the Americans, but no real global security challenges, everybody pours money into economic development. And so from 1990 until roughly 2017, we had the greatest economic boom in human history. And I dare say for most people in the investment world, this is the world that they think is normal. It's not normal. It's the most historically atypical period we have ever known as a species. And it was always going to end because the developing world is aging rapidly, far more rapidly than the rich world ever did. And so they're becoming Germany, but without the infrastructure, without the institutions, without the respect for democracy, without the capital structure, without the industrial base. As well, the Germans and other countries like them were aging into mass retirement. So instead of a world where we've got propensity for growth and cooperation and trade, we're moving into a world where the rich world is all retired. They're neither producing nor consuming. And the developing world is becoming aged and losing that consumption edge, but without building the capacity to move up the value-added chain. You would call this an economic dislocation, which is a very nice way to say global collapse and depression. There are a few countries that stand out as exceptions to that. The United States is at the top of the list. We have the youngest demography in the rich world, and we already have a demography that is younger than China's and will be younger than Brazil's within 20 years. So the United States is slipping into kind of this pocket reality where it builds its own stuff, trades with itself, and maybe a select group of other countries. And say what you will about the Trump administration, and there are so many things that we can say about the Trump administration. One of the things they got right is picking out specific countries that they wanted to have relationships with after this transition. So we've had 4 big successes in trade negotiations: Japan, Korea, Mexico, Canada, and we're probably going to have a 5th one with the United Kingdom this year. That's the majority of the American trade relationship. So the United States, under normal circumstances, given 3, 4, 5 years, could have transitioned from where we are right now to that sort of friends and family trading plan without suffering a recession. What coronavirus has done is knock everything off the table and force the Americans to bring out kind of like fire hoses of stimulus and monetary push in order to keep their system more or less in place. So we've thrown a bottomless supply of money at this, $3 trillion in just the last 6 weeks. That's twice as much as the rest of the world combined. They don't have the kind of capacity that we have, which means that price is no object for the Americans suddenly making this transition in a matter of a few months instead of a few years. And when we emerge on the other side of this, we're going to have American security, but not global security, an American trade network, but not a global trade network, American reindustrialization and global deindustrialization, and a demographic collapse in most of the world. It's going to be a completely new system. But historically it's a lot more normal than what we've been in for the last 30 years. Little backstory. So the core idea that drives a lot of what I do is why the United States did what it did during the 20th century. So we were pulling into Western Germany during World War II, and we're looking on the horizon, and we see the Soviet war machine, and to be perfectly blunt, that's kind of scary as shit. So we were like, okay, this is in a different hemisphere from us. We cannot, with sea lift capacity, fight the Soviets in Europe. We will lose that fight. We need everyone in Europe to be on our side. So we basically bribed them. We rebuilt their countries. We provided them with security overwatch. We provided them with the nuclear umbrella. We opened our market so they could export their way back to being first world countries, if in exchange they allowed us to write their security policies. And that trade, that guns for butter trade, is what enabled the United States to ultimately prevail in the Cold War. The big problem, however, is when we got to 1990 and the Cold War was over, we voted out of office the president who was figuring out what was next, and then voted in 4 successive presidents who didn't care about foreign affairs much at all. And so we've just kind of been on drift now for 30 years. And by providing global security, but not asking for anything in return, Americans became steadily more disenchanted with the world we know. Trump is not simply the natural progression of that. He's just kind of the next step on the road. Whoever comes after Trump is likely to be less inclusive and less internationalist than he is, because the economic structure will demand that whoever is next go that direction. So if you look at, say, the Democratic primaries, when we had like 195,000 people trying to be president, all of them said that Trump was being too soft on China in the trade talks. Trump is not nationalist by American standards on trade. He's kind of middle in the road. And the next phase of this is going to be far more mercantile than anything that we've seen in the last 80 years.